Ever wondered if the story you've always heard about the origin of sin might be hiding something much bigger? We've been taught that sin began with Adam and Eve, an apple, a serpent, a simple act of disobedience, and suddenly sin floods into the world. But what if that version barely scratches the surface? What if the story isn't just about human choices but something far deeper, something planned from the beginning? Was sin inevitable, even orchestrated by the same God known as all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good? Pause here and think about Isaiah 45:7 for a moment, where God himself declares, "I form the light and create darkness, I make peace, and create evil." Wait a minute, God creates evil. The very thing we've been taught to blame on Satan, on human weakness, suddenly appears in God's own words. Is that verse just an anomaly, or does it reveal something much larger, something that turns everything we thought we knew upside down? If God created everything, did that include the potential for evil as well? Now, consider this: free will doesn't exist without the option to choose wrong, and wrong can't exist without a framework that defines right. Sin didn't just appear out of thin air, it was woven into the very structure of creation, a consequence of having rules in the first place. But who made those rules? Exactly. Now follow this thread further. God places Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, a paradise with one massive rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge. But here's the kicker: why even put that tree there? And if God is truly all-knowing, wouldn't he have known that curiosity, desire, and free will would lead them straight to it? So, are we saying that God didn't see that coming, that Adam and Eve somehow surprised him? Or is it far more likely that the entire setup was intentional, a test, that they were always meant to fail? But let's take this deeper. If sin is just a human failing, a mere mistake, why was the capacity for sin embedded in creation from the start? If God knew Adam and Eve would fall and still set the stage for it, isn't it possible that sin served a greater purpose? Perhaps, just perhaps, sin wasn't an oversight, but an integral part of a grander design. Maybe it was a way to push humanity towards something greater, a deeper understanding like moral awareness, the power of free will, or the knowledge of good and evil. And here's the big question: if God created everything, including the conditions that allowed sin to emerge, does that make him responsible for it? Or is it all part of a larger, unfathomable plan that we're still trying to decode? Let's be real. It's hard to imagine an all-powerful, all-knowing being creating a system that's so easily broken without expecting it to break. Sin didn't just accidentally happen, it was built into the very fabric of existence. So let's get straight to the heart of it. Who really bears responsibility for sin? Was it God, setting the rules and fully knowing they'd be broken? Was it humanity, exercising its free will in a world filled with temptation? Or perhaps, just perhaps, sin wasn't created by anyone. It's a byproduct, an inevitable outcome of freedom and choice, the chaos that naturally arises when order meets autonomy. Now let's tackle the God question. If God is truly all-knowing, then he didn't just create the possibility of sin, he foresaw it. The rules weren't arbitrary, and the consequences weren't some unforeseen disaster. God designed the entire system. But this is where things get messy. If God created the environment in which sin could exist, does that mean he indirectly created sin itself? Think about that. God crafted the boundaries, the forbidden fruit, the serpent, every element needed for sin to occur. Are we really comfortable saying that the being we call the embodiment of perfect goodness also set the stage for sin? Mainstream teachings often place the blame squarely on humanity. Adam and Eve, With their curiosity and their choice, they're the ones who unleashed sin, right? But if we truly have free will, wasn't the potential for choosing wrongly part of the deal? Humans weren't placed into a blank slate world where wrong didn't exist. They were set into a place where wrong was right there, literally dangling from a tree. If you throw a match into a dry forest, can you really be surprised when it ignites? You might argue that humanity, with its free will, made a conscious choice to sin. But even that feels too simplistic, too neat. Adam and Eve weren't operating in a void, they were in a system created by someone else. Their sin wasn't a random act of defiance, it was the inevitable outcome of being placed in an environment where temptation was ever present. So how much of that choice was theirs, and how much was a product of the system they were put in? Which leads us to a third possibility: chaos. Maybe sin didn't need a creator, because once freedom existed, so did the potential for chaos. The very rules of good and evil, right and wrong, create a tension. Where there is freedom, there's the potential for disorder. In a world of perfect order, no choices, no chances, sin wouldn't exist. But that's not the world we got, is it? The moment humans were given the freedom to act and to choose, chaos became inevitable. Sin is just the price of freedom. So who do we blame? God, who designed the system? Humanity, who made the choice? Or is it simply the result of free will, the chaos that comes with creation? One thing's for sure: sin wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a one-time mistake. It's woven into the fabric of our reality, something we inherited from the very beginning. And maybe that's the real question we need to be asking: not who created sin, but whether it was ever meant to be avoided in the first place. So here's the next big question: if free will is the foundation of sin, does that mean sin was inevitable the moment free will came into existence? Free will, it's this thing we've been taught to cherish, the ultimate gift from God, right? The freedom to make our own choices and to shape our lives. But there's a hidden catch: the moment free will enters the equation, the possibility of sin becomes unavoidable. You see, free will doesn't come with training wheels. It's not a tool that only works in the right direction. The ability to choose automatically includes the possibility of choosing wrong. So if free will is truly free, then sin was always an option from the start. This means the moment God gave humanity free will, He handed them the keys to both righteousness and destruction. It's a double-edged sword. The ability to choose good means there must also be the capacity to choose evil. No escaping that. Now, think about it: without free will, we're just robots pre-programmed to do the right thing. But with free will, we're faced with real consequences, real stakes. You can't have virtue without the option of vice. That's the trade-off. So was sin actually a failure of humanity, or just the natural consequence of the freedom we were given? If sin was inevitable once free will was granted, then it begs the question: did God know that humanity would fall? If He knew and still gave us free will anyway, then isn't sin part of the design? A calculated risk, maybe even a necessary one. Sin becomes less about rebellion and more about the inherent cost of freedom. It's like handing someone a loaded gun and telling them not to shoot. The temptation is always there. This also raises another crucial point. When we talk about sin, we often frame it as disobedience, as if humanity went out of its way to defy God. But what if sin is simply the byproduct of our very nature? The moment we were created with free will, the potential for sin was born. It was inevitable. It's not that Adam and Eve were flawed or malicious, they were just the first beings to exercise the power of choice in a world where that choice included failure. In fact, you could argue that sin isn't just about breaking rules, it's about the complexity of moral freedom. It's the shadow cast by free will, an unavoidable part of being able to make real decisions. No decision-making power, no sin. But take away free will, and you lose what makes us human, our ability to grow, learn, and become more than what we were. All right, here's the part where everything we think we know about Adam and Eve gets flipped. They're always framed as the first sinners, right? But what if they weren't rebels against God? What if they were just victims of a divine setup? I mean, think about it. Adam and Eve didn't just stumble into sin. They were placed in a garden with one forbidden tree, and that tree was in plain sight, fully accessible. Almost as if it were meant to be found. Does that sound like a test of loyalty, or does it sound like a trap? Let's talk about the tree itself, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You've got Adam and Eve, two beings created with curiosity, intelligence, and free will, wandering in a paradise that's perfect, but with one rule: don't touch that tree. What's even crazier is that God, who is supposedly all-knowing, knew from the start what would happen. He knew the serpent would slither in, knew Eve would be intrigued, and knew Adam would follow. So was this really about disobedience, or were Adam and Eve playing their part in a much larger plan? And let's not forget, they were created without the knowledge of good and evil. They didn't even know what wrong meant until after they ate the fruit. It's almost like giving a child a loaded gun and then acting shocked when something goes wrong. They weren't capable of fully understanding the consequences of their actions because they were naive by design. And yet they're blamed for a choice they couldn't possibly comprehend. Is that justice? Or is it part of some cosmic setup? The serpent, often seen as Satan, is just as fascinating. Traditionally, he's seen as the villain of the story. But what if he was simply fulfilling a necessary role? The serpent didn't force them to eat the fruit. He offered them knowledge. He presented them with a choice. It's hard to ignore the fact that after eating the fruit, Adam and Eve gained awareness, understanding, and yes, wisdom. So was the serpent truly a tempter, or was he the catalyst for human growth? If Adam and Eve hadn't eaten the fruit, they would have stayed in their ignorant, childlike state forever. Was that paradise, or was it stagnation? Think about the setup here. If Adam and Eve were always meant to fall, if their ascent was part of a preordained plan, then we have to reconsider everything. Maybe the fall wasn't the tragic failure of humanity, but the first step toward human evolution. Adam and Eve weren't villains, they were the pioneers of consciousness, of moral awareness, and of choice. In fact, the entire narrative starts to look less like a story of rebellion and more like an invitation to grow. Maybe the true purpose of the garden wasn't to keep humanity innocent, but to offer them the chance to evolve, to move from ignorance to enlightenment. But of course, with that knowledge came the heavy price of understanding good and evil, of living in a world where sin and virtue coexist. In many versions of the story, especially within mainstream Christian teachings, the serpent is equated with Satan, or the ultimate personification of evil. But fun fact, the text in Genesis never actually calls the serpent Satan. That's something that was added much later, through interpretations, commentaries, and evolving theology. In the original Hebrew text, the serpent is just a serpent. Sure, it's crafty, but there's no explicit tie to Satan or a cosmic evil force. So why did later interpretations decide to make that link? Well, think about it. You've got a story about the first humans placed in a paradise with one rule. It's almost too simple, too straightforward. To really drive home the gravity of what happens next, the fall of mankind, the introduction of sin, you need a villain. Enter Satan. But if we strip away those later interpretations, we're left with a much more ambiguous figure, a serpent who talks and offers knowledge. Is that evil, or is it something else? Let's look at the serpent's actions. The serpent doesn't lie. In fact, everything it says to Eve is true. You will not surely die, it says, but your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Spoiler alert. That's exactly what happens. Adam and Eve don't drop dead after eating the fruit. They gain knowledge. They become aware of good and evil. Their eyes are opened, just as the serpent promised. So was the serpent truly deceiving them, or was it telling them the truth, just not the full truth? There's also the question of motive. Why did the serpent do what it did? The traditional explanation is that Satan, as the ultimate antagonist of God, was working to corrupt humanity, to pull them away from their innocence and lead them into sin. But what if the serpent wasn't acting out of malice? What if its role was to offer humanity a choice, an opportunity to evolve? After all, what is free will without the possibility of choosing something other than what you're told? This is where things get philosophical. If we view the serpent as a bringer of knowledge, not just a tempter, then the entire story shifts. The serpent becomes less of a villain and more of a catalyst, a being that offers Adam and Eve a chance to move beyond the boundaries of ignorance and innocence and into the realm of moral complexity. And yeah, that came with consequences, pain, suffering, the awareness of death, but it also came with consciousness, understanding, and growth. In a way, the serpent opened the door to what makes humanity human. Let's zoom out a bit. In many ancient cultures, serpents were seen as symbols of wisdom, renewal, and transformation. Look at the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, representing the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. In ancient Mesopotamian mythology, serpents were linked to knowledge and the divine. Even in the Greek tradition, the serpent was associated with healing and enlightenment. So could it be that the serpent in the garden wasn't meant to be a figure of corruption, but one of transformation? Now, this isn't to say the serpent was some benevolent guide leading humanity to enlightenment. It's much more complicated than that. The knowledge of good and evil came at a high price: banishment from Eden, the loss of innocence, a life filled with toil and suffering. But wasn't that always going to be the outcome? Once you introduce free will, once you allow for the possibility of choice, you also open the door to pain, regret, and consequences. In this context, the serpent's role becomes a lot murkier. It's not just about tricking Adam and Eve into disobeying God, it's about presenting them with an alternative. Up until that point, Adam and Eve were living in a state of blissful ignorance. They didn't know pain or suffering, sure, but they also didn't know knowledge, wisdom, or freedom. The serpent didn't force their hand. It gave them an option: stay in paradise, following orders without question, or take a leap into the unknown and gain the ability to think for themselves. Think about that for a second. The serpent's role was to offer Adam and Eve the possibility of choice, real choice. Before that moment, they were just following orders. But after their encounter with the serpent, they were suddenly in control of their own destiny. Yes, they chose disobedience, and yes, it came with consequences, but they were finally making their own decisions. They had moved from innocence to experience, from ignorance to knowledge. There's an argument to be made that without the serpent's intervention, humanity would have remained in a kind of eternal infancy. Innocent, yes, but also stagnant. without knowledge of good and evil, and without the capacity for moral decision-making, what kind of life would Adam and Eve have lived? Sure, they'd have remained in paradise, but would that have been a fulfilling existence, or just a safe, sheltered one? This brings us to a larger question: was the serpent really the antagonist in the story, or was it fulfilling a necessary role? Without the serpent, there's no fall, no sin, no banishment. But there's also no growth, no evolution, no consciousness. It's like the spark that lights the fire. Without it, there's no danger. But there's also no light. The serpent's presence in the garden wasn't just a test, it was the turning point that led humanity out of the innocence of Eden and into the real world, where choices have weight and actions have consequences. If the serpent was fulfilling a necessary role, if it was part of the plan all along, then who's really responsible for the fall? The serpent may have played its part, but it didn't create the rules, didn't plant the tree, and didn't set up the scenario. That was God. The serpent's role, then, was to offer humanity the chance to take responsibility for its own future, to step into the unknown and claim the knowledge that had been kept from them. Let's dive into the figure everyone loves to blame, Satan. It's almost automatic, right? Anytime we talk about sin, temptation, or evil, we point fingers at the devil. But what if the role Satan plays in the creation of sin is far more complicated than the typical fallen angel turned ruler of hell and narrative we've been told? First off, let's get one thing straight: the popular image of Satan, with horns, a pitchfork, and a fiery underworld, comes way later in history. In the earliest texts, including the Old Testament, Satan isn't even portrayed as the ruler of hell. He's more like an accuser, a kind of prosecutor working for God. In the book of Job, for instance, Satan doesn't rebel against God, he tests Job's faith with God's full permission. This is a long way from the narrative where Satan is this ultimate evil force scheming to drag humanity into sin. But we're not talking about Jobs right now. We're talking about whether Satan was the true creator of sin. The question is, where did this idea come from? The idea that Satan is the architect of all human suffering and rebellion against God. Let's break that down. The most common story we associate with Satan's fall comes from two key biblical passages, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. But here's the twist: both of those passages are talking about human kings, not Satan. Isaiah 14 is a taunt against the king of Babylon. And Ezekiel 28 is condemning the king of Tyre. These aren't descriptions of Satan's rebellion against God, but over time theologians interpreted them as symbolic references to Satan's downfall. So the image of Satan as this rebellious angel who fell from heaven and brought sin into the world. It's built on layers of interpretation, not direct biblical texts. Let's move on to the real moment people associate with Satan's involvement in human sin, the Garden of Eden. Sure, the serpent is often seen as Satan. But again, the text in Genesis never explicitly says that. It's only later that Christian tradition linked the serpent to Satan. So where does that leave us? Did Satan create sin, or did he simply facilitate a choice that was always going to happen? What if Satan, or more accurately, the serpent, wasn't some rogue figure disrupting God's plan, but part of the plan all along? After all, an omniscient God would have known exactly what was going to happen in the garden. If the serpent hadn't tempted Eve, would sin have entered the world in some other way? If Satan is merely the tempter, then he's not the creator of sin, he's just the one pointing toward it, a catalyst rather than the source. He provides the option, but humanity takes the action. Now, let's tackle this head-on. Could Satan, if he was indeed involved in humanity's fall, have acted without God's allowance? The traditional view is that Satan is in constant opposition to God, but if we look closely, the Bible doesn't portray him that way in the earliest texts. In fact, Satan's power seems to be limited by what God allows. So if Satan tempts humanity, it's within boundaries set by God. Does that mean sin, in its origin, is still part of the divine plan? Here's something to think about. If Satan created sin, then why does he still exist? Why hasn't an all-powerful God wiped him out? It would be logical, right? Get rid of the problem at its root. But Satan is still present throughout the Bible, always lurking in the background. This suggests that his role in sin's creation, or its continuation, isn't accidental or chaotic. There's a purpose. If Satan was acting against God's will, wouldn't God simply have ended his existence? And that brings us to one of the most mind-bending possibilities. Satan isn't the creator of sin. He's the agent that makes sin visible, but the actual choice, the birth of sin, happens in the human heart. Satan tempts, but humans choose. The serpent whispers, but he reaches for the fruit. Sin wasn't forced on humanity. It was offered as an option. And that's the key. Without free will, sin wouldn't exist. But with free will comes temptation, and Satan is simply the embodiment of that temptation. What if sin wasn't just an accident, a misstep in the divine plan, but actually necessary for humanity's growth? I know it sounds insane. We've spent thousands of years treating sin as this cosmic blunder, something we were never supposed to fall into. But what if, just what if, sin was always part of the deal? We've already talked about free will, the serpent, and the choices that Adam and Eve made. But if we take a step back and look at the big picture, things start to shift. Adam and Eve's so-called fall didn't just lead to pain and suffering, it also opened up the door to wisdom, to the knowledge of good and evil. They didn't just lose paradise, they gained something profoundly human. The capacity to understand morality, to make choices with consequences, to evolve. If Adam and Eve had never sinned, would humanity have ever progressed beyond the innocence of Eden? Eden wasn't just a paradise, it was a place where ignorance reigned. No knowledge of good and evil, no complex understanding of the world, no curiosity or self-awareness. It's like living in a bubble, safe but stagnant. Is that really what we think humanity was meant for? To stay in a childlike state forever, shielded from the harsh realities of existence? Maybe the fall was less about disobedience and more about awakening. Yes, sin brought pain into the world, but it also brought the possibility of growth. Without sin, there would be no need for redemption, no need for progress. There would be no stories of human resilience, no moments of triumph over adversity. Sin created a world where struggle exists, but it's in that struggle that we find meaning, purpose, and the drive to improve. Think about the heroes of our own lives, people who've overcome incredible obstacles, who've wrestled with darkness and come out stronger on the other side. Would those stories exist in a sinless world? Would we even know what good meant without evil to contrast it? It's a tough pill to swallow, but maybe sin introduced a kind of necessary tension. A tension that pushes humanity forward. It's uncomfortable, but that discomfort forces us to grow, to question, to become something greater. Let's dive even deeper. If God knew everything, and most belief systems suggest he does, then he knew sin was coming. He knew what Adam and Eve would do. So why create the scenario at all? If God is all-knowing, Sin wasn't some surprise move, it was baked into the plan. It's almost as if Eden was never meant to be a permanent home. It was a starting point, a place for humanity to begin, not to remain forever. Sin wasn't a detour, it was the road itself. What if sin was the key to unlocking the full potential of humanity? Without it, we wouldn't have free will in its fullest sense. We wouldn't have moral complexity, and we wouldn't have the same depth of experience. Sin made the world messier, sure, but it also made it richer. Of course, this raises another important point. Does this mean God intended for humanity to suffer? Not exactly. But maybe suffering, while painful, also has a role in shaping who we are. Through suffering, we learn compassion, empathy, strength, and perseverance. These are the qualities that define the human spirit. And all of that comes from the choice Adam and Eve made. A choice that led to sin, but also to growth, to knowledge, to becoming more than they were in the garden. So was sin necessary? I'll leave that for you to decide. But one thing's for sure, it wasn't some random mistake. It was part of the grander design, a catalyst for evolution. Humanity didn't just fall, we rose to the challenge that sin presented. And we've been grappling with that challenge ever since. Maybe that's the real story. Not the fall of humanity, but the rise of human consciousness, the birth of moral complexity, and the journey toward understanding what it means to truly live. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video thought-provoking, or if it gave you a new perspective, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. It really helps support the channel. And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below. What do you think about the origins of sin? Let's keep the conversation going. Thanks again, and see you in the next video.